Every election is talked about as maybe the most important of our lifetimes. But we have to ask ourselves, is this really true now? A lot of people consider Trump to be the most divisive president in history. Many commentators who are not prone to hyperbole have raised the question of whether democracy can actually survive 4 more years of this person. Military generals are coming out of the woodwork to oppose him, which is not something they typically do. There's a cadre of never-Trumpers who have emerged in a way that seems different than any previous election. So maybe we really are at a crossroads in this election. It seems to me that the last several weeks have shown us that we're at a critical inflection point. I think that there's, one way of putting it is that there's 2 different visions that are in conflict. One vision represents a new look at what is community, what are the parts of our history that we need to lift up and not ignore, what are the parts that we need to no longer deny and ignore. We see that in the protests. There's another vision, and that vision says, for America to be great, we must go back to a previously great time. Make America great again. So the good news is, in the midst of all this tumult and strife, we have an election to help us make a collective choice between those different visions. So we have to ask ourselves, what is our role individually at this inflection point? What do we want to do personally? What I want to talk about is the way that our social position should influence our thinking about what our role should be. What I want to talk about is the reasons why I think that white allies, white progressive people, have a special role to play at this inflection point. And in order to play it effectively, there's some things y'all need to do differently than y'all have been doing. Okay. So far as anything else, I just want to say this. We know that Zoom fatigue is real. So I want to give you the option of, if you want, you could turn the camera away and just listen, put your feet up, and relax and take all of this in. That I'm not going to be insulted if you do that. I would ask you, though, if you do that, don't start checking your phone and checking your email. I'd ask you to listen. But if you want to disengage visually and just engage orally, that's fine. Okay. So one of the things we know is that support for Mr. Trump is very deep and very intense. He said last time he could shoot people on Fifth Avenue and not lose any voters. Obviously that's apocryphal, but clearly there is a level of intensity for some of his supporters that is beyond what we've seen with any politician in recent memory. Some people have called it the cult of Trump. So there's no question that there are a whole bunch of people who ride or die for Trump. And I've even read some people say that even though they know that he is so flawed and so wrong in some ways, they are going to go down with the ship. So that feeling is out there. There's no question about that. And we can also see, so that's one thing, we can also see that right now he's really behind. 10, 12, 14 points behind. I'll remind you that George Bush was behind by 17 points to Michael Dukakis, and Michael Dukakis is not an ex-president. So things can turn around. There's no question that that's true. So I think that we have to start thinking seriously about the issue of Trump persuadable voters. There's not that many of them, but there are some. Most polling experts say that there are between 28 and 20% of his support are persuadable people. Now, obviously, that's a big gap, but even at the low end of that, that's 8%. One out of one out of 9 people, one out of 11 people, one out of 12 people are potentially Trump persuadable voters. So I would submit that from a strategy of us mobilizing the populace, we need to think about what are we doing for those Trump persuadable voters. Now, some people have done some analysis of these voters, and they say a couple things about them. They say that one of the things these people feel strongly about is political correctness. That's useful to know that. These people are often steeped in working class values, respect for religion, respect for military service, and for character traits encouraged by small business, honest labor, hard work. So these are largely working class folks. So one of the things that we have to grapple with if we're going to reach these Trump persuadable voters, we have to know who they are. But I think we have some cultural impediments we have to get past if we're going to try to reach them. One of them is the generalized polarization we have in American society. Almost everybody's aware of that, and everybody doesn't like it. So my understanding is that polling data tells us that about 81% of folks are disturbed by the level of polarization. So people on the left and the right recognize that we are far too polarized. Now, I would go further than that and say one way of thinking about that polarization problem is that we are experiencing a compassion problem across the left-right divide. I'll just illustrate with a couple of other statistics. 43% of Americans say they have acted uncivilly toward other people based on politics. 50% of both Republicans and Democrats have said they've ended a friendship with someone because they were uncivil.
That's true.
27% of Republicans, 31% of Democrats say it would be harder to get along with a new person if they're in their community if they were a member of another party. That's a problem. That is a problem. I'll tell you another one. Forgive the gender skew of this question. In 1958, 34% of Republicans and Democrats wanted their daughter to marry someone of the same party. By 2016, that was 61%. So I would submit that it is useful to think about this polarization as a problem of compassion. We don't want those people in our neighborhoods. We don't want them in our families. There are other stats that show huge portions, more than 50% of folks are afraid of the other party. So I think that we have to think about, it is useful to think about this polarization issue as a compassion problem. We lack compassion for people on the other side. Compassion might be defined as the ability to see oneself in other, right? As opposed to, contrast to otherizing, right? Where we turn people into other. I think that the tribalism of American politics, our tribal nature, which has become identified with political parties, has caused us to turn and look at those people, if we're progressive, look at conservative people as other. That's not healthy for democracy. It also is not healthy for persuasion. Now, I would just want to add this briefly. I want us all to remember that this lack of compassion, this tribalism, this way we turn the people on the other side into other, is actually also being stoked by Mr. Putin. He pays a small army of people millions of dollars to have us at each other's throats, to have us demean each other, to have us look down on each other, to have us generate contempt for each other. That's his success model. As to illustrate the way I've seen that in trainings, I've had people in trainings back in the days when we actually had meetings in person. I've had people tell me, I miss those days, people tell me that I wouldn't let a Trump supporting neighbor in my house. Now, these are people conceivably that like might be watching your house when you're gone. I've had people tell me, I'm not going to talk to my cousin until Trump's out of office. Now, I think that as somebody from a culture that values family, I think that is a problem. I wanted to, this was a friend of mine, but I wanted to smack her or grab her by the shoulders and say, what is wrong with you white people? For the way that, in my perception, the way that white people are willing to throw away people based on who's in office in Washington, I think is crazy. It's crazy for family development. It's crazy for personal survival. And that attitude, where I just can't deal with you, is not helpful for the process of us developing a culture where we can actually respond and persuade people when we run across people who are persuadable. So, I think that one of the things we have to cultivate is a better and greater and more easily accessed sense of compassion for Trump supporters, for people we disagree with. Where we are now is not good for democracy, and it's not good for our capacity to be persuasive. One of the things that happens now is that, this is my perception of dealing with white allies, is there's a level of agitation that happens that if you know somebody is a Trump supporter, that is way out of whack in comparison to what we need to create the society that we want. So I want to just do a little poll on this, on two questions related to this. So the first question, if you call it the first polling question, is basically about how many Trump supporters do you know? Allison, can you call up that question? So yeah, how many people do you know who you think or know are Trump supporters, with whom you had a reasonably pleasant relationship and you see him at least once a year? Is it none? Is it 1 or 2? Is it 3 to 6, 6 to 12, or more than 12? So Allison, the way this is working, I can see the question, but I cannot see the ongoing voting. So you're going to have to both close the poll and let me know what it says.
Okay, I will. I think we've probably got enough people responding. I'm not sure. Well, there's a few more coming in. 87% of the people have responded. I'm not sure if people on their phones can respond, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. It's been exactly 1 minute, and here are the results. Can you see the results?
I can. So basically, 93% of us know people, and about 3/4 of us know a few people. And okay, so we can see, so hopefully people can see the results. So, as I thought, y'all know Trump supporters. Okay. So this is a live issue, and so what we all must think about is how do we interact with these people. I would add one more thing about how we interact with those people. Obviously, those people are going to vary between intense ones, the people who are part of the cult, and people who are persuadable. But here's what's important to know. Part of what Trump's success model is portraying the idea that his supporters are despised by other people. So I want to encourage you, when you interact with a Trump supporter, to try to be civil to them, because by not being civil to them, you are playing his game. You increase support for Trump by being obnoxious, being boorish, being condescending. You help him do that. So even if you're not dealing with somebody who is persuadable, I would just encourage you to think about finding a place of civility in that interaction, because if you don't do that, you're increasing support for him even among people who are not persuadable. And moreover, as I will discuss, if you're going to have a chance of persuading persuadable people, you are certainly going to need to not act boorish, condescending, demeaning, etc. Okay. So a core point that I want to make sure y'all understand is that what we have now is a situation in which white progressives are opting out of this conversation in a way that I think nobody else is, and is particularly problematic. It's a poll done by Washington Post a few years ago that had asked people, how do you feel about talking across the like Trump, don't like Trump divide? And he's a polarizing figure, and so, not surprisingly, 59% of people found those interactions stressful and frustrating as opposed to stimulating and interesting. 59% overall. Let's do the crosstabs on that. 52% of conservatives found that kind of interaction stressful and frustrating. 56% of black liberals found those interactions stressful and frustrating. 61% of Latino liberals found it stressful and frustrating. And the portion of white liberals who found it stressful and frustrating was 74%. 74%. So what that means is that the very people who might be in the best position to have these conversations are the least inclined to have them. We know that if you look at those different groups, the people most likely to have Trump supporters in their network are white people. Trump got 8% of the black vote, he got 26% of the Latino vote, he got 27% of the Asian vote, and he got 58% of the white vote. So who knows Trump supporters is white people. What liberals know Trump supporters? White people. Who doesn't want to talk to Trump supporters? White people. So I would submit to you that just as progressive culture, we need to strategically develop the capacity among white people especially to talk across that divide, or to at least push y'all's disinclination to talk across that divide down to levels that match the people of color. I cannot explain what's going on with y'all deciding I just can't deal with these people, but y'all need to fix that, because y'all are the people who have the capacity, the access to Trump supporters, and who could potentially persuade some to vote differently. Now, there's some things you're going to have to learn to do that. Some of them are technique-y. So one of the things that I teach in the White Ally Toolkit work about racial issues, and it applies here, is I remind people of the idea of code switching, which basically is something that black people had developed for hundreds of years. And basically what that's about is you talk differently to people who get you than people who don't get you. So if you want to be persuasive to somebody, you have to think, how do I present myself and present my information differently to have the maximum chance of influencing people? Not just how do I feel and I present myself the same way to everybody. So yes, it's fine to simply blast away at Trump when you're talking to other people who don't get him. If that's how you want to express yourself, that's fine. But if you want to have a chance of being persuasive and not being perceived as boorish and condescending, then you might need to train yourself to talk differently when you're talking to Trump supporters. That's an important thing to learn how to develop. Certainly when you're talking about racial issues, but also when you're talking about non-racial. We're talking about Trump in particular. Okay. So I want to suggest some specific strategies that might be helpful. I have written a book called Compassion Transforms Contempt. It's available on whiteallytoolkit.com, and it is specifically about what white progressive people should think about as they try to influence this election, especially as they try to potentially engage persuadable voters. It's available on the website. One of the things that I suggest people do is something that it might be kind of difficult. It looks like it's difficult. It requires a shift in thinking. I suggest something called at the beginning of a conversation about Mr. Trump, something I might call the Trump gift exchange. It's based on this idea. As you enter a conversation about Mr. Trump, this is especially with somebody who is dyed in the wool, but also maybe even persuadable. You say, I want to shift the energy, make sure that this is less conflictual than it might be. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you X number of compliments of Mr. Trump, and in exchange for that, I want X minus 1 critiques of him. And the purpose of that is because doing that, reminding each of you that he is not the devil, although he's pretty bad. He's not the devil, and he's not a god. Doing that by you saying some positive qualities about Mr. Trump, and them saying some critiques, shifts the energy. You already are out of the all or nothing thinking that so drives unproductive conversations. In the book, this is in the appendix, I give 12 different examples of positive qualities of Mr. Trump. He's funny. Despite the kind of weirdness with Ivanka, he appears to love his family. He's relentless. Right? Those are just 3 examples off the top of my head. The point is not to use my examples, although I provide them if you want to do that. The point is, choose ones that you can occupy, and as an act of both reconciliation and of conciliation, as well as of shifting the energy in the conversation, I'm suggesting to think about, okay, before we get started, let's do this. So, because you can say, blame it on me. An expert told you, a dialogue expert told you that was going to be helpful to do. So that's one small technique. Now, just to be clear about how deep the antipathy to Trump is, I have been in churches giving a talk not unlike this, and I've had people holler out, with Jesus overlooking us all, he has no positive qualities. He don't have any. Now, come on now, I'm not a super Christian, but I do know that one of the tenets of Christianity is that we're all children of God. And so everybody has positive qualities. But the antipathy to recognizing that is so deep that you got people in church hollering out he ain't got no positive qualities. So that's just one particular method that I want to suggest you consider. Now, I want to step back for a moment and just clarify how I see this, what our roles are. In this election, I think that basically white progressives got 2 jobs, people of color got 1 job. The job that both people of color and white people have, we need to learn how to persuade people to vote. All across the spectrum, progressives and liberals, our voting rate in this country is pitifully low. We could talk about, in the long run, automatic registration, we could talk about all that. But as it stands now, we don't have that. We need to know how to persuade people to vote. And as you're trying to persuade people, it is key that you not make them feel demeaned. I suspect that the voting rate record on people on this call is pretty high, and it might be hard to talk to somebody who doesn't vote, maybe who's committed to not voting. They might have a philosophy about it, they might not. It is hard to persuade, it's hard to interact with them and to embody some respect for their position. But here's the key. If you're going to persuade people, they can't feel demeaned. They can't feel talked down to. They need to feel related to. So one of the things that I try to teach people, and we'll do in an upcoming course, is how to persuade people to vote who appear to be left-leaning but non-voters. So that's a job that white people have and people of color have. But as I have said, there's a specific job that white people have, and that job is to look at the people in their circle, figure out who's a Trump persuadable, and make an effort to try to persuade them. This project, White Ally Toolkit, started because I perceived the 2016 election as a massive white ally fail. As we all know, Trump won Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by less than 78,000 votes, and that's why he's in office. So just imagine, had 200,000 people in those states, which is not a lot of people, 200,000 white people, each try to just have a conversation with the people in their circle, with 3 different people, about whether Trump was too racially problematic to elect. Not trying to preach at him.